Just a nurse. The words landed with a dismissive laugh just as Chief Petty Officer Ethan Brooks let the emergency room blanket fall from his shoulder. I've had corpsmen patch me up in worse places than this. I'll wait for a doctor. The room went briefly quiet before several members of his SEAL team exchanged amused looks. Charlotte Hayes didn't answer. She checked the monitor clipped to his finger, reviewed the trauma notes from the paramedics, and adjusted the overhead exam light without acknowledging the insult. Outside the trauma bay, another ambulance siren echoed through the loading entrance, reminding everyone that St. Andrew Medical Center had no time for bruised egos. Ethan folded his arms as Charlotte reached for sterile gloves. "You hearing me?" he asked. "I said I'll wait." Charlotte met his eyes for the first time. "You can absolutely wait if you choose. But before you do, I'd like 30 seconds to examine your shoulder." Her tone carried no irritation, only confidence. Ethan smirked and leaned back against the bed. "Fine. 30 seconds." She began with simple questions, confirming where the training accident had happened, how he landed, and whether his fingers had ever gone numb after the impact. Instead of focusing only on the swollen shoulder, she watched the way he rotated his wrist, how his breathing changed when he shifted his weight, and the subtle tension across his upper back. Her attention drifted for only a second to an old surgical scar near his collarbone before returning to the present injury. "Can you lift your arm above shoulder level?" she asked. Ethan raised it halfway before stopping. "Hurts. Where exactly?" "Front." "And now?" she asked, guiding only with words instead of touching him. He repeated the movement. His expression tightened for an instant before he forced another grin. Charlotte nodded once. Before she could continue, a young emergency physician stepped beside the bed after glancing at the chart. "Looks like a routine shoulder strain," he said. "Let's get him discharged with a sling after the x-rays." Charlotte didn't respond immediately. Her attention remained fixed on Ethan's fingertips. She noticed the faint change in color that appeared only when he held his arm in one position for several seconds. "Doctor," she said, "I'd like to check circulation again before discharge." The physician frowned. "His vitals are stable." "I know. Then let's not delay radiology." Ethan chuckled. "See? Even the doctor says I'm fine." Charlotte looked back at Ethan instead of arguing. "Would you squeeze my fingers?" He shrugged and did as instructed. The grip felt strong. Then she asked him to release and repeat the motion after rotating his shoulder slightly outward. This time the strength faded almost instantly. Ethan noticed it too, though he tried not to show it. Charlotte checked his pulse near the wrist, then compared it to the opposite side. A nurse nearby noticed the change in Charlotte's expression. "Something wrong?" she asked. "Possibly," Charlotte answered. "I'd rather rule it out than miss it." The physician hesitated before sighing. "Fine. Repeat the vascular assessment." Ethan rolled his eyes but stayed still. Charlotte completed the exam with practiced precision, saying very little. Whatever she found, it erased the certainty from the physician's face. "Order a CT angiogram," Charlotte said. "Now?" he asked. "Yes. That's excessive for a training injury." Before she could answer, the charge nurse hurried into the room holding a cordless phone. "Charlotte," she said, lowering her voice, "someone from a federal office keeps asking whether you're on duty today." They refused to leave a name. Charlotte's eyes remained on Ethan's arm for one brief moment before she looked toward the hallway, her expression unreadable. Somewhere beyond the emergency department entrance, the elevator doors opened, and two people in dark business suits stepped into the corridor carrying identical government credential cases. The two visitors stepped out of the elevator with the unmistakable posture of federal agents, their dark credential cases drawing brief glances from nurses and physicians moving through the crowded emergency department. Neither of them spoke to the registration desk. They scanned the treatment area, exchanged a quick look, and remained near the corridor instead of approaching anyone. Charlotte noticed them only for a second before returning her attention to Ethan Brooks. The physician had already entered the order for the CT angiogram, but radiology called to report a delay because 2 trauma patients from the highway collision had been taken first. Ethan leaned back with folded arms. Looks like I get to sit here for another hour because of a theory. Charlotte checked the color of his fingertips again before asking him to slowly open and close his hand every 10 seconds. Please avoid lifting your shoulder above chest level until imaging is finished. Ethan shook his head. You are still treating me like I am made of glass. One of his teammates laughed. Chief, she probably read that in a textbook yesterday. Charlotte ignored the comment. She watched Ethan reach for the plastic cup on the bedside table with his injured arm. Halfway through the motion, he stopped for the briefest instant before switching to his other hand without realizing it. She made a quiet note in the electronic chart. The emergency physician glanced over her shoulder. You are documenting every little movement? Charlotte answered without looking up. Patterns matter more than isolated findings. Before he could respond, an overhead announcement called for additional staff to Trauma Bay 3. The physician hurried away, leaving Charlotte alone with Ethan. Moments later, another patient was rushed past the room, and the sudden activity pulled everyone's attention toward the hallway. Charlotte noticed something different. Ethan had unconsciously begun rubbing 2 fingers together every few seconds. Do those fingers feel colder? She asked. No, he replied immediately, then paused. Actually, maybe a little. She placed the back of her fingers lightly against both of his hands for comparison. The difference was slight but consistent. She requested a portable Doppler ultrasound from the supply room to perform another circulation check while waiting for imaging. A senior nurse passing by frowned. Radiology already has him on the list. There is no reason to tie up another machine. Charlotte answered, if blood flow changes before he leaves this room, I would rather know now than after the scan. The nurse hesitated but walked away without agreeing. Ethan watched the exchange with growing curiosity. You really think something is wrong? Charlotte met his eyes. I think something deserves another look. A few minutes later, the portable Doppler arrived anyway after another nurse found one available nearby. Charlotte completed the assessment with practiced efficiency, saying almost nothing as she listened for the pulse signal at different arm positions. Ethan could not interpret the sounds, but he noticed the slight change in her expression when she repeated one measurement twice. Before she explained anything, the senior nurse returned holding a clipboard. Charlotte, those federal visitors asked for the staff directory. She lowered her voice. They did not ask for the hospital administrator, the trauma chief, or hospital security. Ethan looked toward the corridor where one of the suited visitors had quietly stopped in front of the employee recognition board. Instead of reading every name, the visitor's eyes settled almost immediately on a single photograph, and after a brief pause he removed a folded envelope from his credential case without saying a word. Charlotte Hayes had barely finished updating Ethan Brooks's chart when the emergency physician returned holding a tablet with the radiology schedule. The scanner is still backed up, he said. If his circulation remains stable for another 20 minutes, we can downgrade the priority. Charlotte looked once more at Ethan's injured arm before answering. Please do not lower the priority yet. I would like one more vascular assessment after he changes position. The physician exhaled. Charlotte, we already accommodated one extra request. She nodded respectfully. I understand. I am only asking because his symptoms are reproducible, and that usually means something is changing instead of resolving. The physician hesitated, then walked away without agreeing. Ethan watched the exchange with folded arms. You really do not give up. Charlotte smiled faintly. Neither should anyone responsible for a patient. Several minutes passed while another trauma team rushed through the hallway toward an incoming ambulance. Ethan shifted on the bed to make room for a portable monitor being wheeled past. The instant he reached behind himself with the injured arm, his expression changed. He immediately lowered it again. Pins and needles, he admitted. That is new. Charlotte was already beside him. She checked the pulse at his wrist, compared both hands, then asked him to extend each finger one at a time. The difference was subtle but measurable. She documented the exact position that reproduced the symptoms before calling the physician back. This time she did not speculate. She simply repeated the findings in precise clinical language. The physician performed the same examination himself, paused longer than before, then looked toward the nurse's station. "Move his angiogram ahead of the routine orthopedic cases," he instructed. Ethan glanced at Charlotte with obvious surprise. "So you were right," she answered without satisfaction. "The examination was right. That is what matters." The atmosphere inside the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Ethan's teammates stopped treating her observations as unnecessary caution. One of them stepped closer and asked, "How did you notice something nobody else caught?" Charlotte adjusted Ethan's arm onto another pillow before replying. "Sometimes the body tells you more during movement than when it is perfectly still." The answer sounded simple, yet nobody could explain how she had recognized the pattern so early. Even the physician lingered for a moment as though reconsidering his first impression of her. Before leaving, he quietly reviewed her notes again instead of correcting them. While transport prepared to move Ethan toward imaging, Charlotte noticed him unconsciously protecting the shoulder in exactly the same way he had when he first entered the department. "Keep your elbow close to your side during the transfer," she said. "It should reduce the symptoms." Ethan followed her advice without arguing. A few seconds later, he looked back in mild disbelief. "It actually feels better." One teammate gave Charlotte an appreciative nod, the first sign that skepticism was giving way to respect. Across the hallway, the two unidentified visitors remained where they had been, speaking to no one. One of them watched Charlotte for several silent seconds before opening the government credential case again. Instead of removing identification, he took out a thin folder marked only with a barcode, studied Charlotte from across the department, then closed it immediately as though one brief look at her had confirmed a question neither Ethan nor anyone else in the emergency room even knew had been asked. Charlotte Hayes walked beside the transporter as Ethan Brooks was finally cleared for imaging, keeping one hand lightly on the wheelchair while watching the position of his injured arm rather than the busy hallway around them. The emergency department remained crowded with trauma patients, nurses crossing paths every few seconds, and overhead announcements directing staff from one critical case to another. Ethan noticed that Charlotte never looked rushed despite the constant movement surrounding her. Instead of staring at monitors, she seemed to absorb everything at once. Halfway to radiology, she suddenly stopped. "Hold for a second," she said. The transporter looked confused until Charlotte pointed toward one of the wheelchair footrests. It had not locked completely into place after being adjusted for another patient. "If that slips during the ramp, his shoulder will take the force." The transporter crouched to inspect it and found the latch only partially engaged. "Good catch," he admitted. "I would not have seen that." Ethan said nothing, but his expression changed again. That was the second time she had prevented a problem before anyone else even noticed it. As they continued toward imaging, they passed two paramedics bringing another patient into the department. One of them accidentally brushed a supply cart, sending several sealed packages toward the floor. Before anyone reacted, Charlotte caught the cart with her free hand while keeping Ethan's wheelchair steady with the other. The movement looked effortless, practiced rather than dramatic. She immediately checked whether the sterile supplies remained intact before helping the paramedic. Reorganized the cart in exactly the order the labels indicated. The older paramedic stared for a moment. Most people would not know those packs have to stay in sequence. Charlotte simply smiled and continued walking. Ethan glanced toward the paramedic. "You know her?" The man hesitated. "No. I just have not seen many people outside emergency transport pay attention to details like that." The answer raised another question instead of resolving the first. When they reached the radiology waiting area, Charlotte reviewed Ethan's identification bracelet before handing the chart to the imaging nurse. She paused for only a fraction of a second after reading the operation date printed on one section of his medical history. "Was that your last deployment?" she asked. Ethan looked surprised. "Yes. How did you know?" Charlotte pointed to the timing of the previous surgical repair listed in the record. "The rehabilitation period matches almost exactly." Ethan studied her face as though trying to remember where he might have seen her before. Nothing came to mind, Yet her observations felt strangely familiar, almost like someone who understood the routines of military recovery without needing them explained. Before he could ask another question, the two suited visitors appeared at the far end of the hallway. They did not interrupt the imaging staff or identify themselves. One of them watched Charlotte hand over the chart, then quietly compared the barcode on the thin folder in his hand with the patient tracking board mounted outside radiology. The other gave a nearly imperceptible nod and slipped the folder back into the credential case. Neither man spoke a single word. Charlotte turned to leave, unaware they were still there. But as the automatic doors to the imaging suite closed behind Ethan, one of the visitors raised his hand toward a small communication earpiece and murmured a sentence too faint for anyone nearby to hear. Whatever he said caused the second visitor to straighten immediately and fix his eyes on Charlotte as she disappeared back toward the emergency department. Charlotte Hayes had just finished documenting the latest patient when a sharp voice echoed from the next treatment room. "I cannot get a reliable blood pressure reading," a young nurse called out as several clinicians gathered around an elderly man whose condition had changed unexpectedly while waiting for admission. The attending physician stepped in and began issuing instructions, but the patient had become increasingly restless, making every measurement inconsistent. Charlotte paused at the doorway for only a moment before noticing that the cuff had been placed over a thick winter sweatshirt and that the patient's arm remained unsupported above heart level. "Try one adjustment first," she said. The physician glanced at her briefly. "We already have enough people in here." Charlotte did not argue. She simply rolled over a pillow, supported the patient's elbow, asked another nurse to remove the heavy sleeve from beneath the cuff, and suggested waiting 30 seconds before repeating the measurement. The room fell silent as the monitor displayed a stable reading that matched the patient's clinical appearance. The physician looked back at the previous numbers, then at Charlotte. "That explains the discrepancy." He thanked her before immediately changing the treatment plan based on the corrected measurement. Several staff members exchanged surprised looks. The solution had not required extraordinary skill, only disciplined observation under pressure, yet nobody else had recognized the simple problem before she did. Ethan Brooks's teammate had witnessed the entire exchange from the hallway and slowly folded his arms. Earlier that morning he had dismissed Charlotte as an inexperienced nurse. Now he found himself replaying every decision she had made since Ethan arrived. She had predicted changes before they occurred, prevented small mistakes before they created larger ones, and repeatedly noticed details that experienced clinicians had overlooked. None of it seemed dramatic by itself, but together the pattern became impossible to ignore. A few minutes later, the physician approached Charlotte at the nurse's station. "Good catch back there," he admitted. "How did you notice it so quickly?" Charlotte smiled politely while updating another chart. "The equipment usually tells the truth. If the numbers do not match the patient, I check the process before I question the patient." The physician nodded thoughtfully and walked away without another word. His opinion of her had clearly changed. At that moment, the two suited visitors finally crossed the emergency department instead of waiting near the corridor. They stopped several feet from the nurse's station but did not interrupt patient care. One of them removed the sealed envelope from his credential case and quietly compared the printed name on the front with Charlotte's identification badge from a distance. After a brief exchange of glances, the second visitor produced a small photograph from inside the thin government folder. The image showed several people wearing field medical gear with their faces partially obscured by protective equipment. One figure stood near the center. The visitor looked from the photograph to Charlotte, then back again before returning the picture to the folder without allowing anyone else to see it clearly. Ethan, who had just returned from radiology with his arm supported in a sling, noticed the unusual exchange from across the hallway. He watched one of the visitors lower his voice and speak only 6 words to his partner. "It is definitely her. Do not rush." The statement answered nothing, yet it changed everything. Whoever these people were, they had not come to investigate a patient or inspect the hospital. They had come looking for Charlotte Hayes specifically. Ethan stared across the emergency department as a single question settled into his mind. If she truly was only a nurse, why would federal agents arrive carrying old photographs that appeared to include her years before she ever worked at St. Andrew Medical Center? Charlotte Hayes left the sealed envelope exactly where she had placed it and returned to her patients before opening it. A decision that puzzled nearly everyone watching. One of the federal visitors noticed it as well. Instead of reminding her about the delivery, he simply stepped aside and allowed her to continue working. Across the emergency department, Ethan Brooks watched another nurse approach Charlotte. With the preliminary report from his CT angiogram, the imaging confirmed a positional vascular compression that required specialist evaluation rather than immediate discharge. Ethan looked down at his injured arm, remembering every recommendation Charlotte had made over the past hour. None of them had been dramatic. Every one of them had been correct. The realization unsettled him far more than the diagnosis itself. A few minutes later, the vascular surgeon arrived, reviewed the imaging, and compared it with Charlotte's earlier nursing documentation. He paused after reading her notes. "Who documented the positional findings before imaging?" he asked. The emergency physician pointed toward Charlotte, who was already assisting another patient several rooms away. The surgeon nodded once. Those observations shortened this workup considerably. He offered no further praise and simply continued discussing Ethan's treatment plan, yet his brief acknowledgement carried weight because it came from someone evaluating the evidence rather than the person who had gathered it. Ethan listened without interrupting. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, he realized the nurse he had dismissed had quietly influenced every important decision in his care. As Charlotte passed the nurse's station again, one of the federal visitors stepped forward just enough to speak in a respectful tone. "Ms. Hayes, there is no urgency. Please finish your shift first." Charlotte thanked him but still did not open the envelope. Ethan noticed the exchange immediately. Most people would have been eager to discover why federal representatives had arrived in person. Charlotte treated the envelope no differently than another document waiting to be reviewed after patient care. Her priorities spoke more loudly than any explanation could have. Nearby, one of the older emergency nurses smiled to herself. "She has always been like that," she said while preparing medication for another patient. "Patients first. Paperwork later." Ethan looked at her. "How long have you worked with Charlotte?" "Almost 4 years," the nurse answered. "She never talks much about where she worked before coming here. We only know she arrived with outstanding recommendations and a habit of staying long after every shift ended whenever someone needed help." That simple comment explained part of Charlotte's character but answered none of the larger questions surrounding her. Moments later, the second federal visitor quietly unfolded the thin folder once more while standing several feet away from the nurse's station. This time the folder revealed only a single page before it was closed again. Ethan caught a brief glimpse of several heavily redacted lines and one visible phrase near the bottom that read, "Medical Support Citation." He could not see the name attached to the document before the visitor closed the folder, but the wording lingered in his mind. It matched everything he had witnessed throughout the day without explaining why federal officials were carrying it. Charlotte finally picked up the sealed envelope after completing her last medication check, slipped it unopened into her locker, and reached for her stethoscope to answer another patient call. As she turned away, the first visitor looked toward his partner and gave a subtle nod. The second visitor responded by removing one final item from the credential case. Not another document but a worn photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. Even from across the hallway, Ethan could tell it had been handled many times over the years. Before anyone else could see the image, the visitor carefully placed it back inside the case, leaving Ethan with one unavoidable question. What could possibly be in that old photograph that mattered more than every official document they had already brought to the hospital? The emergency department gradually settled into its familiar rhythm, yet something had changed in the way people moved around Charlotte Hayes. No one announced it. No one pointed it out. It simply became visible in dozens of small moments. When another trauma patient arrived, the emergency physician who had questioned her judgment that morning no longer second-guessed her recommendations. Instead, he met her eyes and asked, "What are you seeing?" Charlotte reviewed the patient, shared 2 concise observations, and returned to her work without acknowledging that anything between them had changed. The physician adjusted the treatment plan accordingly, not because of the federal visitors or the photograph, but because the entire day had demonstrated that her careful assessments consistently deserved attention. Ethan Brooks watched from the observation area while waiting for final discharge instructions. Earlier he had viewed Charlotte through the narrow lens of her job title. Now he found himself paying attention to something entirely different. Every patient received the same patience. Every family member received the same respect. Every coworker, regardless of experience, received the same willingness to help. The qualities that had impressed the federal visitors were the very same qualities everyone inside the hospital had been benefiting from for years without fully recognizing them. Ethan's teammates gathered near the nurse's station as discharge paperwork was completed. The youngest among them hesitated before walking over to Charlotte with a small paper cup of fresh coffee from the cafeteria. He placed it beside her computer without interrupting her charting and simply said, "You have been taking care of everyone else all day." Charlotte looked up with genuine surprise, thanked him, and took one sip before another call light illuminated on the monitor. Without another thought, she set the coffee aside, stood immediately, and headed toward the next patient room. The untouched cup remained on the desk as another reminder that her priorities never changed. The older emergency nurse noticed the scene and smiled to herself. "That is Charlotte," she said to no one in particular. "If she has to choose between finishing her coffee and answering a patient, the coffee always loses." Across the department, one of the federal visitors quietly picked up the still unopened envelope from the nurse's station and carried it to Charlotte's locker after receiving her permission with a simple nod. He placed it safely inside without opening it and closed the locker door. The gesture carried unexpected meaning. For the first time since arriving, the visitors adapted themselves to Charlotte's routine, instead of expecting Charlotte to adapt to theirs. Even they recognized that her work came first. Ethan received clearance to leave the hospital after the vascular surgeon reviewed the treatment plan one final time. Before walking out, he stopped beside the nurse's station once more. He did not offer another apology because he understood that words were no longer necessary. Instead, he placed the visitor badge he had worn throughout the afternoon neatly into the return tray, rather than leaving it on the counter as many people did. Then he straightened one chair that had been left blocking the hallway before quietly stepping aside for an incoming stretcher. Charlotte noticed the small gesture only in passing, yet it reflected the same attention to others she had demonstrated throughout the day. People often learned more from example than from instruction. As Ethan reached the exit, he turned for one final look. Charlotte was already kneeling beside another patient, explaining a procedure with the same patience she had shown to every person who entered the emergency department that day. There was no audience watching her now. The federal visitors remained in the background. The physicians had returned to their own responsibilities, and the excitement had faded. Yet Charlotte worked exactly as she had before anyone recognized her. Ethan smiled faintly to himself before walking through the hospital doors, understanding at last that the greatest measure of character was not how someone behaved after earning respect, but how they had behaved long before anyone thought to offer it. Charlotte Hayes finally reached the end of her shift as the evening lights reflected across the glass entrance of St. Andrew Medical Center. The emergency department had settled into its familiar rhythm again, with new patients arriving, monitors sounding in the distance, and fresh staff taking over for the night. She completed one last chart, checked that every patient under her care had been handed over properly, and only then removed her identification badge. The sealed federal envelope still rested inside her locker exactly where she had left it. She picked it up, slipped it into her bag without opening it, and closed the locker door. Nothing about her routine suggested she believed the envelope was the most important thing that had happened that day. To Charlotte, another completed shift and patients safely cared for remained the greater accomplishment. Ethan Brooks finished signing his discharge papers and paused near the hospital entrance before leaving. Earlier that morning he had walked through those same doors believing titles alone revealed a person's worth. Now he found himself watching nurses, physicians, technicians, and support staff with a different perspective. He noticed the young resident who had begun asking better questions instead of pretending to know every answer. He saw one of his own teammates quietly helping hospital transport staff move equipment without being asked. Even the emergency physician who had challenged Charlotte's recommendations now listened more carefully before reaching conclusions. None of those changes had come from speeches or formal lessons. They had grown naturally from one person's example over the course of a single day. Charlotte walked through the department one final time before clocking out, thanking the night shift nurse receiving her patients and wishing the environmental services staff a peaceful evening as they prepared another treatment room. The gestures were simple, yet every person she spoke to responded with genuine warmth. Respect had replaced assumptions. Familiar smiles had replaced hurried introductions. The extraordinary moments that had unfolded throughout the day quietly disappeared back into ordinary hospital life, leaving behind something far more lasting than excitement. They left behind trust. As Charlotte reached the main entrance, Ethan stepped aside to hold the door open before she could reach for it. Neither of them mentioned the federal visitors, the photograph, or the words that had changed the entire day. Ethan simply said, "Take care." Charlotte smiled. "You too. Follow the surgeon's instructions." Ethan laughed softly, promising that this time he would listen the first time. It was a small exchange, yet it carried the weight of everything that had happened between them. They no longer stood on opposite sides of misunderstanding. They stood on equal ground built through respect. Charlotte walked toward the employee parking lot as the evening air replaced the constant sounds of the emergency department behind her. Ethan watched her leave until she disappeared beyond the row of parked cars, then looked back once at the hospital entrance where the words he had spoken that morning echoed in his memory. Just a nurse. He understood now how incomplete those words had been. A title had never explained the person. It never could. Somewhere inside the hospital another call light illuminated. Another patient needed help, and another shift continued exactly as countless shifts had before. Tomorrow another family would meet Charlotte Hayes without knowing anything about the federal visitors, the photograph, or the respect she had quietly earned. They would simply meet the nurse standing beside them when they needed someone most. Ethan smiled to himself, adjusted the sling supporting his recovering shoulder, and walked toward his car carrying something far more valuable than a discharge packet. He carried a new way of seeing people before judging them. Inside the hospital, another nurse asked where Charlotte had gone. The charge nurse glanced toward the parking lot and answered with a small smile, "Home. She will be back tomorrow." And tomorrow, just as today, she would save lives without asking anyone to know her story.